Today we're going to be talking about utilitarianism. But first, if you remember back to our lesson on Kant, you'll remember that he said that consequences cannot be accounted for when we're talking about morality because they're just so unpredictable. Utilitarianism, on the other hand, is a consequentialist theory that uses the consequences as the basis for whether or not an act is moral. So utilitarianism, it's a consequentialist theory that states that one should do whatever brings about the greatest possible balance of happiness over unhappiness, where each person's happiness is counted equally. Now there's a few things to remember about this definition here. The first is that we're doing the greatest possible balance of happiness over unhappiness. This doesn't necessarily mean the greatest amount of happiness total. So if we were to give it a number, it's not necessarily 100, especially if on the opposite side, the other consequence or the negative consequence is a negative 75. We're looking for the greatest balance. So if we have one consequence, one action that says that it's a positive 75, but it only brings about 2 unhappiness, that balance is higher, or that ratio is a lot bigger, so we would want to go with the action that gives us that much happiness because it only gives us that much unhappiness. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we're talking about the hedonic calculus, but I still want to go over this definition with you a little bit. So the second part, each person's happiness is counted equally. That means that everybody counts as one, right? We talked about in the minimum conception of morality how we need to be a little bit impartial. We need to have some sort of impartiality when we have a moral theory, and utilitarianism really attempts to account for that by counting each person's happiness equally or as one. All right. So as promised, I told you we're going to be talking about the hedonic calculator, and the hedonic calculator is exactly what it sounds like. It's a calculator that calculates happiness. So hedonic is pleasure or happiness. And the hedonic calculator was invented by Jeremy Bentham. He's one of the 2 main founders of utilitarianism theory, the other one being John Stuart Mill. But he thought that you could quantify happiness in a way that you could actually see. And so when we use the hedonic calculus, we're essentially calculating the consequences of our action in terms of happiness and unhappiness. And the great thing about the hedonic calculator is that we do it all the time, and we do it in our everyday life, you know, whether we're deciding what clothes we should wear or the food we should eat, or whether or not we should do something that might be a little bit immoral. We use it regularly. It's intuitive, and while we might not actually write out the calculations, it is intuitive to the way that we think about consequences. So let's just go through an example of the hedonic calculus. So let's say that the action that we are considering whether or not to go to school today. So there's going to be a lot of different consequences to this action, whether we do it or not. Some of them are positive, and some of them are going to be negative. So one of the positives, you get to learn. Learning is always a positive, but maybe you don't get to sleep in. But again, on the flip side, you get to see your friends, but maybe you don't get to wear pajamas. And there's a whole list of consequences that we can go through. Maybe the cafeteria food is bad. But you get to find out your test scores, which were A's. Right? So we have all of these different consequences that we can go through based on the action to go to school. Now, in the hedonic calculus, we go through each of these actions, or each of these consequences, rather, and we give them a number. So maybe learning is plus 10, plus 10 happiness. That's the unit of measure that we're using is happiness. I like to call it oodles, but we'll just call it happiness for now. You get to see your friends. We'll say that's a plus 7. And your test scores, that's a plus 5. And then over here, Not sleeping in, we'll give that a -5. No pajamas, maybe a -3. And the cafeteria food is just so bad that we'll give it a -7. Now, we add up each side and we'll find out whether or not the moral thing to do would be to go to school. So over here we've got 17 plus 5, that is 22. And then over here we've got -8, -15. So because we have more positive than negative, the right thing to do in this situation is to go to school. And while this might seem like a really intuitive way to think about morality and consequences, and it's very simple, right? We have one thing that we have to consider, and that's happiness, right? We don't have to take into consideration whether or not God says it's the right thing to do, or whether or not we're doing it from duty, right? It's very intuitive in that way, but it's not a perfect system. And the main or the most famous problem that we address with this theory, with utilitarianism, is called the trolley problem. So it says, imagine that you are this person right here, and you have a choice. You have to pull the lever, and the trolley is either going to go onto this track or this track. Now, somebody very, very bad has tied people to these tracks, so one way or the other, someone is going to get hurt. On this side, you've got 5 complete strangers. You don't know who they are. You don't know what kind of life they live. They have no connection to you. But on the other side is your mom, and you love your mother, right? She's great. She makes the best cookies. She's always been there for you. You love your mom. But if we're going to do a hedonic calculus, which we'll do right now, we'll find that the right thing to do might not necessarily be the thing that you want to do. So over on this side, if we were to have the track go this way onto this track right here, we'll have a lot of negative, right? So you've got -10 for each of these people, because the likelihood is that they're not going to be very happy about getting run over by a trolley. So over here you have -10. Now if you let it go this way, we'll say that mom gets a -10, and so do you, right? Because she's your mom, you're devastated by this, but even if you add that up, the right thing to do is going to be to put it on the track that has your mom on it, because you and your mom count for -20, while these people over here count for -50. So the hedonic calculus would tell you that the right thing to do, which is always, in the case of utilitarianism, to create the greatest balance of happiness over unhappiness, would be to turn the track so that it goes over onto this track and your mother. That seems really upsetting, right? And so one of the problems with utilitarianism is that it doesn't account for personal relationships. The right thing to do in this situation isn't necessarily the right thing for you. And so what it's asking you to do is really difficult. It's a lot, right? And while we do want impartiality and morality, you're still a human being and you have personal relationships. And so the devastation of actually like pulling the trigger to do this to your mother rather than strangers would be really traumatic for you. And so one of the problems with utilitarianism, not only does it not account for personal relationships, but the expectations might be a little too demanding. A second problem with utilitarianism is called the utility monster. And this is our utility monster. He is not pretty. But the concept of the utility monster is that he gets so much happiness from causing harm that it outweighs the harm that he causes. So let's say that he really likes to pull people's hair on the train. So when he's sitting on the train on his way to work, he likes to pull people's hair. It's not the most devastating thing that you could do, but it's inconvenient, it's unpleasant, And more than that, it's an invasion of your personal space. So every day on the train, he pulls these people's hair, and it gives them a -3 in happiness. So again, it's not the worst thing, you know. After he pulls the hair, he walks away from them. They don't have to deal with him anymore. And they kind of just go about their day, but it's not pleasant, right? So each of them get a -3 on this scale, but the pleasure that he gets out of pulling these people's hair is really, really high. So let's say he gets a +25 out of doing this every day. So if we add up our hedonic calculus, we've got 18, -18, but he's at +25. So the right thing to do under this system would be to continue pulling these people's hair. But that doesn't seem right, especially because there's so many different people being affected by his actions as opposed to his. But again, you're counting in utilitarianism, you're counting everybody's happiness equally. So he counts as one, this person counts as one, this person counts as one, this person counts as one, but even collectively as a group, they don't outweigh the happiness that he gets from being unpleasant. On the flip side of that, we have the problem of majority rule, right? So let's say that this is Mr. Grumpkin, and he is really unpleasant. He's kind of just the town outcast. Nobody really likes him. He's belligerent. He's not very nice. Maybe he even smells weird. But he doesn't necessarily do anything wrong. He's not immoral. He doesn't inconvenience people. He's definitely not the utility monster. He doesn't pull people's hair. He sticks to himself, but nobody really likes him. But let's say that the town decides that they've just absolutely had enough of Mr. Grumpkin. And for each of them to outcast him or even cause him bodily harm would be a +5. Now the harm that they would cause him, again, considering that everybody's happiness counts equally, even if they were to give him a -10, which we'll say is the highest amount of unhappiness that you can get, the collective happiness that comes from doing harm to Mr. Grumpkin outweighs significantly the amount of unhappiness that Mr. Grumpkin would get in the situation. So you've got 20 up here, so you're at +45 to his -10. So under utilitarianism, the right thing to do would be to cause harm to Mr. Grumpkin. But that doesn't seem fair either. And so what we're finding in utilitarianism is something called the problem of justice. It doesn't necessarily account for anything except happiness. So things like justice or personal relationships or undue stress aren't necessarily considered when we're using this theory. But we know that morality has more to do with happiness, right? Justice is a big factor when we're talking about morality. And so the fact that this system doesn't account for that is usually a reason why philosophers just count it out automatically. But there are a lot of things worth saving in utilitarianism. Like I said before, it's very intuitive. People tend to use this in their daily life, whether they realize it or not. The hedonic calculus is something that we just use automatically when making decisions in our life. And more than that, the fact that it counts everybody equally, it has real consequences that it uses as its basis, gives a lot of positives to this theory. So there's a couple solutions to classic utilitarianism. First, some utilitarians really double down and say, look, if you're not happy with the outcomes of utilitarianism, you're not considering all of the consequences. They say, if you were to really bring it out to all of the consequences that come from an action, you would probably see that it is the right thing to do, even if, right up front, it doesn't quite seem like that. On the same side of that, your intuitions might be wrong. So while we might think that the right thing to do is to save our mother, our intuition might be wrong in that situation. The right thing to do would be to save those 5 other people, especially if we considered all of the consequences in that situation. We would come to the conclusion that utilitarianism does bring us to the right course of action, and just because it seems like it's not right up front doesn't necessarily mean that that's true. So again, some utilitarians double down and say you're not considering all the consequences or your intuitions are wrong, but others come up with some solutions that are a little bit more compromising. So one such thing is called rule utilitarianism. And it uses the same principles, right? So find the greatest balance of happiness over unhappiness, with everybody's happiness considered equally, but do it within a certain set of rules. So they make some rules that you need to follow in most, if not all, situations to make sure that justice is being served. So maybe they make rules like no murder, which seems like a pretty good one, no theft, account for minority interests, and so on and so on. And the idea is that rule utilitarianism will somehow temper the something like the utility monster or majority rule when it gets out of hand in a way that it not only saves the system but actually improves it. So moving forward, when we start talking more specifically about healthcare, utilitarianism is going to be really important because, like I said, we tend to use it in our daily life, whether we realize it or not. But the great thing is that in healthcare, we not only have to consider morality, but we also have to consider resource stewardship. And utilitarianism is a system that we can use not only for morality, but also for realistic resource stewardship of finite resources.